billionaire tech mogul hadn't expected to die today. Marcus Rothwell gripped the controls of his custom-modified Gulfstream G650ER as hydraulic warning lights painted his cockpit red, the kind of crimson that meant choices were narrowing fast. Somewhere over the Zagros Mountains between Iraqi and Iranian airspace, 38,000 feet above terrain that didn't forgive mistakes, his $70 million aircraft was bleeding fluid from systems he'd been assured were triple redundant. His personal pilot had collapsed from what looked like a stroke 20 minutes into the flight, leaving Marcus alone with deteriorating controls and a radio that crackled with languages he barely understood. He'd made his fortune disrupting industries, building empires from algorithms and ambition, but physics didn't care about market capitalization. The Gulfstream shuddered as another hydraulic system failed, and Marcus felt the stick growing heavier in his hands, responding like something wounded. He'd logged enough simulator hours to hold a basic license, enough to look competent at cocktail parties when he mentioned flying his own jet, but those pristine sessions hadn't prepared him for this. The sky outside was the kind of empty blue that looked peaceful until you understood how far you could fall through it. Iraqi air traffic control was shouting coordinates he couldn't process. Turkish controllers were declaring airspace violations in clipped English. Someone was mentioning fighter intercepts. Marcus wiped sweat from his eyes and tried to remember the emergency procedures his pilot had walked him through exactly once, 6 months ago. Over coffee he'd been too distracted to finish. The autopilot had disengaged when the third hydraulic line failed. Now he was hand-flying a crippled aircraft through some of the most contested airspace in the Middle East, and his hands were starting to shake. Not from fear exactly, though fear was definitely present, but from the muscle fatigue of fighting controls that wanted to do anything except what he needed them to do. Then something appeared in his peripheral vision. Low, too low for commercial traffic, moving with purpose that looked almost predatory. Marcus blinked, certain he was seeing things, but it remained. An aircraft, gray and angular, rising from terrain he hadn't even registered as being that close. It looked like something from another era, brutal and utilitarian, bristling with weapons pods and painted in colors that suggested it belonged to conflict rather than conquest. The strange aircraft leveled out maybe 200 feet below his wing, close enough that Marcus could see details. Close enough to understand this wasn't coincidence. Someone had come looking for him. The radio crackled with a voice that carried the kind of calm that came from deciding fear was optional. Gulfstream November 77 Delta Romeo, this is Hawkeye 23 United States Air Force. I've got your 6. Follow my lead and stay on my wing. We're going to get you on the ground. Marcus stared at the A-10 Thunderbolt II riding formation below him. The pilot's voice had been female, steady as a metronome, carrying authority that didn't ask for permission. He keyed his radio with shaking hands. Hawkeye 23, I'm losing hydraulics. I don't know how much longer I can keep this aircraft controlled. There was a pause, just a breath, then that same unshakable voice. Copy your hydraulics. I can see your control surfaces from here. You're doing better than you think. What's your flight experience? Marcus laughed, a sound that came out more desperate than he intended. 40 hours, simulator mostly. I'm not actually qualified for this. Another pause. Marcus watched the A-10 adjust position slightly, the pilot clearly evaluating something. 40 hours is 40 more than 0. I'm Captain Reina Vasquez, call sign Hawkeye. I've been flying combat air support for 12 years. Today you're my mission. Do you trust me? The question hung in the thin air between their aircraft. Marcus looked at his failing systems, at the mountains below that rose like teeth, at the A-10 that had appeared from nowhere like some kind of armored guardian angel. I don't have a lot of choice. Sure you do, Vasquez replied, and Marcus could hear something almost like a smile in her tone. You can trust me, or you can trust those hydraulics. I know which bet I'd take. Marcus made his decision. What do you need me to do? The A-10 slid forward slightly, and Marcus noticed details he'd missed initially. The aircraft was scarred, paint worn at the edges, but it moved through the air with a precision that suggested the pilot knew exactly what the machine could do. Weapons hung from hardpoints like promises of violence held in reserve. Vasquez's voice came through clear and measured. First, we establish rhythm. I'm going to be your reference point. Ignore your instruments for the moment. Watch my aircraft. Match my turns, my altitude changes. Your instincts are going to want to overcorrect. Don't. Small inputs. Think of it like dancing. I lead, you follow. Dancing. Marcus had paid $15,000 for ballroom lessons before his third wedding. Hadn't helped save the marriage, but apparently the principle might save his life. He focused on the A-10, watching as Vasquez demonstrated a gentle bank to the left. Marcus followed, his Gulfstream responding sluggishly but responding. Good, Vasquez said. Your control surfaces are degraded but functional. You've got more aircraft left than you think. Now we need to talk about where we're landing. Your fuel status, Marcus checked his gauges. 40 minutes, maybe less. Copy. Closest suitable field is Al-Assad Air Base, Iraq, 43 miles northwest. We'll make it, but it's going to be tight. Problem is, we're currently in airspace that makes multiple countries nervous, and you're flying an unidentified business jet that's been declared a possible hijacking. The words took a moment to register. Hijacking? Who declared me a hijacking? Turkish air defense about 12 minutes ago when you stopped responding to radio calls and deviated from your flight plan. Iranian controllers think you might be a reconnaissance platform. Iraqi coordination is trying to sort it out, but nobody's happy about an unknown Gulfstream wandering around up here, which is where I come in. I'm your escort, your translator, and your credibility. As long as you're on my wing, you're under United States Air Force protection. People might not like it, but they'll think twice before shooting. Marcus processed this information, watching the A-10 make another gentle correction. How did you even find me? Vasquez's laugh was brief, professional. My squadron was running patrol patterns out of Al-Assad when your distress calls started hitting emergency frequencies. Command tasked me to intercept and assess. I've been tracking you for 20 minutes, staying low, making sure I understood the situation before I introduced myself. Didn't want to spook you. 20 minutes. She'd been watching, evaluating, planning. Marcus felt a strange gratitude for that patience. Thank you, he said, and meant it more than any thanks he'd given in years. Thank me when you're on the ground. For now, concentrate. We're going to descend to 20,000 feet. Your cabin pressure might complain, but we need to get you to an altitude where the air is thicker, easier to control the aircraft. I'll go first. You follow. Rate of descent 500 feet per minute. Nice and easy. The A-10 nosed down with a grace that seemed impossible for something so brutally designed. Marcus followed, feeling his Gulfstream settle into the descent like a wounded bird grateful for lower altitudes. Vasquez maintained her position, always visible, always steady. Her voice came through with updates every 30 seconds, a rhythm that became reassuring. Marcus found himself matching his breathing to her radio calls, using them like a heartbeat to stay focused. They passed through 25,000 feet. The mountains below were getting larger, more detailed, more threatening. Marcus could see valleys and ridges that looked like places aircraft went to die. Vasquez kept him focused. Eyes on me, not the terrain. The ground only matters when we're landing on it. Right now, it's just scenery. But the scenery had teeth. Marcus watched a ridgeline pass maybe 3,000 feet below and understood how quickly altitude could disappear. Hawkeye 2-3, I need to know something. Why are you in an A-10? I thought those were for close air support, ground attack. Why not an F-16 or something faster? There was a pause, longer than the tactical updates. When Vasquez spoke again, her tone carried something heavier. Because A-10s go low, we operate in the weeds where the ground and sky negotiate. We're built to take damage and keep flying. We're designed to bring people home. Today, that's you. An F-16 would be fast, impressive, gone before you could blink. But I can stay with you, match your speed, guide you through this. Sometimes slow and ugly beats fast and pretty. Marcus understood he was hearing philosophy earned through experience he couldn't imagine. How many people have you saved? Another pause. Define saved. I've provided close air support for ground troops under fire. Does that count? I've escorted damaged aircraft before. Twice. Both times they landed safely. but saving is complicated. Sometimes you save people by destroying things that want to kill them. Sometimes you save them by just being present when they need someone to believe they can make it. The honesty was unexpected. Marcus watched the A-10 make a minor adjustment, Vasquez compensating for wind shear he hadn't even felt yet. "Your aircraft," he said. "It looks old." "She's a 1979 model, built when your parents were probably in college. Updated avionics, new engines, but the airframe is original. A-10s were supposed to be retired a dozen times, but we keep proving we're still needed. There's something about a platform designed to survive that ends up being hard to kill. We're like cockroaches, ugly, persistent, and somehow essential." Marcus found himself smiling despite everything. "I built my first company in my parents' garage. We weren't pretty either, but we worked." "Then you understand the principle. Now we're approaching Al-Assad's airspace. I'm going to talk to their tower, establish our arrival. Your radio is going to get busy. Don't respond to anyone except me unless I specifically tell you to. Understood?" "Understood." Marcus watched as Vasquez keyed her radio, switching frequencies with the ease of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The A-10 pilot's voice changed, becoming more formal, more military. "Al-Assad Tower, Hawkeye 2-3, flight of 2, 40 miles southeast, inbound emergency. I'm escorting civilian Gulfstream November 77 Delta Romeo. Hydraulic failure, pilot incapacitation, non-rated pilot at controls. Requesting priority handling and emergency equipment." The tower's response was immediate. "Hawkeye 2-3, Al-Assad Tower, copy emergency. Runway 28 cleared, winds 270 at 8 knots, altimeter 3002. Emergency equipment rolling. Confirm your escort only, the Gulfstream is autonomous." "Negative, tower, I'm active escort. The Gulfstream pilot has minimal experience and degraded controls. I'll be talking him through the approach and landing. Request you clear all other traffic and give us the longest runway you've got." There was a pause, and Marcus could imagine the tower controllers exchanging glances. "Hawkeye, be advised, runway 28 is 10,000 feet. Gulfstream should have no issues with length." "Copy, but his hydraulics are failing. Braking might be compromised. I want every foot you can give us." The tower acknowledged. Vasquez switched back to their private frequency. "Marcus, you heard that. We're cleared for runway 28. 10,000 feet of concrete, which is more than enough if everything works perfectly. We're going to assume nothing works perfectly and plan accordingly." Marcus felt his heart rate climbing. The theoretical emergency was becoming practical reality. Landing. Actually putting this aircraft on the ground with systems that were failing in ways he didn't fully understand. Vasquez seemed to sense his anxiety. "Talk to me, what are you feeling right now?" The question surprised him. "Terrified, I've never landed anything this big. The simulator sessions were always with full systems." "Good. Fear means you're taking this seriously, but let's convert that fear into focus. You've been flying for 30 minutes with degraded systems. You've made turns, maintained altitude, descended on command. You've been landing this whole time. You just didn't know it. Landing is just a controlled descent that ends with wheels on pavement instead of air under your wings. The principles are identical." Marcus wanted to believe her. "But the approach, the speed, the flare, I'll walk you through every step. Right now I need you to configure for landing. We're 20 miles out, time to get ready. Lower your landing gear." Marcus reached for the gear lever, hesitated. "What if the gear doesn't come down, the hydraulics? Then we deal with that when it happens." "But you won't know until you try. Gear down." He pulled the lever. The Gulfstream shuddered as the landing gear extended, and Marcus watched 3 green lights illuminate on his panel. "Gear down and locked, 3 green." Vasquez's voice carried genuine satisfaction. "Outstanding, see. Aircraft still has fight left in her. Now flaps to approach position, should be around 15 degrees. Marcus extended the flaps, feeling the aircraft's handling change as the wing configuration altered. Flaps 15. "Perfect speed," Marcus checked. 210 knots. "Too fast. We need you at 160 by the time we reach the outer marker. Start reducing power, gentle, don't yank it, coax it." Marcus eased the throttles back, watching his airspeed begin to decay. The Gulfstream settled into a descent he hadn't commanded, the nose dropping as speed decreased. Panic spiked. Vasquez's voice cut through immediately. "Stick back. You lost speed, nose wants to drop, that's physics. Gentle back pressure. Find the trim. Stop fighting the aircraft and make it want to do what you need." Marcus pulled back on the stick, feeling the nose rise. Too much. The aircraft ballooned. He pushed forward, overcorrecting, and the nose dropped again. Vasquez stayed calm. "Breathe. You're in a PIO pilot-induced oscillation. You're chasing the aircraft instead of anticipating it. Stop trying so hard. Small inputs. Let the aircraft settle. Use trim to help you." Marcus forced himself to relax his grip to make smaller corrections. The oscillations dampened. The Gulfstream stabilized into something resembling a controlled approach. Vasquez continued. "Better. Much better." That's the hardest lesson for new pilots. Sometimes the best thing you can do is less. Now we're 15 miles out. Al-Assad is at 12 o'clock. You should see the runway environment soon. Look for the airfield. Marcus scanned ahead. Heat haze made everything shimmer, but then he caught it, a straight line against the irregular desert, the unmistakable geometry of a runway. "I see it." "Good. That's home. That's where we're going. I'm going to position slightly ahead and to your left. I'll be your guide path. Where I go, you go. My altitude becomes your altitude. My approach angle becomes your approach angle. You're going to follow me down like I'm painted on rails. Understood?" Stood. The A-10 slid forward, positioning itself perfectly in Marcus's field of view. Vasquez's aircraft became his entire world. They descended through 12,000 feet, the desert rising to meet them. Heat thermals buffeted both aircraft, and Marcus fought to maintain position. Vasquez's voice remained steady. 10 miles, speed check. 170, still too fast. Copy, reduce more. We need 160. Add flaps to 30 degrees. That'll help slow you down and give you more drag. Marcus extended the flaps further, feeling the aircraft shudder as the wing reconfigured. The speed began dropping more rapidly. 160. Perfect, lock that speed. We're riding this number all the way down, 5 miles out. Al-Assad, Hawkeye 2-3, flight of 2, 5 miles, gear down, emergency traffic. The tower acknowledged. Marcus could see fire trucks moving along the runway's edge, red lights flashing against the desert tan. The sight should have been reassuring, but instead reminded him how wrong this could go. Vasquez descended lower, the A-10 now barely above the desert floor, leading Marcus down an invisible path. 3 miles. You're doing great, speed still good, Marcus checked. 162. Close enough. Here's what happens next. I'm going to guide you to about 50 feet above the runway. At that point, I'll break off. You'll be on your own for the last part. You're going to reduce power to idle, let the aircraft settle, and when you're maybe 10 feet up, you're going to gently pull back on the stick. Not a lot, just enough to slow your descent. The aircraft will settle onto the runway. Then, and this is important, you keep pulling back. You want the nose wheel to stay up as long as possible. Let the main wheels do the work. Marcus's mouth was dry. What if the brakes don't work? Then you'll have 10,000 feet of runway to slow down. Plus, we briefed emergency equipment. They've got arrestor gear if needed, but your brakes will work. Some brakes are better than no brakes. Trust the aircraft. 2 miles. Marcus could see individual buildings now, parked aircraft, the tower. Everything was becoming real with terrifying speed. Vasquez descended lower still, the A-10 now in ground effect, riding the cushion of air compressed between wings and earth. 1 mile, final check, gear down, 3 green, flaps, 30 degrees, speed, 160. Excellent, half mile, you've got this, Marcus. Thousands of Gulfstreams land every day. Yours is just going to have a better story, quarter mile. I'm breaking off in 3, 2, 1, break. The A-10 peeled away with sudden violence, rolling left and climbing, leaving Marcus alone with the runway rushing toward him at speeds that made his simulator sessions feel like gentle suggestions. 50 feet became 40. Vasquez's voice stayed with him. Power to idle, let her settle, don't fight it. Marcus pulled the throttles to idle. The Gulfstream's descent rate increased. 30 feet, 20. The runway was right there, concrete details visible, painted numbers growing. 10 feet. Marcus pulled back on the stick, gentle pressure, exactly as Vasquez had instructed. The descent slowed. 5 feet. The main wheels touched with a squeal of rubber that sounded like angels singing. Marcus kept pulling back, keeping the nose up. The aircraft rolled on its main gear, speed bleeding away. The nose wheel settled onto concrete with a thump that rattled his teeth. Now came the test. Marcus pressed the brake pedals, feeling them sink under his feet with terrifying ease. But the Gulfstream slowed. Not quickly, not with the authority of full hydraulics, but enough. The runway markings slid past at decreasing speed. 5,000 feet remaining. The aircraft was down to 80 knots. 4,000 feet, 60 knots. 3,000 feet, 40 knots. The Gulfstream rolled to a stop with 2,000 feet of runway still ahead, sitting on concrete in the Iraqi desert like it had always meant to be there. Marcus sat motionless, hands still gripping the controls, not quite believing he was stationary. Vasquez's voice crackled through his headphones. Hawkeye 2-3 to November 7-7 Delta Romeo. How do you feel? Marcus tried to speak, found his voice had temporarily stopped working, tried again. I'm on the ground. You are absolutely on the ground. And it was a damn fine landing for someone with 40 simulator hours. Emergency equipment is approaching. Stay in the aircraft until they clear it. Your pilot needs medical attention. But you, Marcus Rothwell, just flew a crippled $70 million jet through contested airspace and put it on a runway without killing yourself. That's going in the logbook. Marcus watched emergency vehicles surrounding his aircraft, medics rushing toward the cabin door. Where are you? Overhead, watching, making sure you're safe, that's the job. Marcus looked up through his windscreen, scanning the sky. He caught movement, the A-10, circling at maybe 1,000 feet, keeping vigil. I need to thank you properly. When you land, Vasquez cut him off, but gently. I'm not landing at Al-Assad. I've got fuel and my squadron is expecting me back at base. We'll file the appropriate reports. Someone will debrief you about what happened, but my part of this story ends when you're safe, and you're safe now. Marcus felt something like loss, which made no sense. He'd known this pilot for less than an hour. Will I see you again? There was a pause, and Marcus thought he could hear a smile in Vasquez's voice. Probably not. That's how this works. We show up when people need us, we do the job, we go back to waiting for the next time we're needed. But you'll remember today, and maybe that's enough. The A-10 rolled into a turn, wings catching sunlight, and Marcus understood he was watching something he'd never fully comprehend. A person who'd chosen service as a way of life, who'd made saving strangers into a calling. Hawkeye, he said, needing to say something that mattered. Whatever they pay you, it's not enough. The laugh that came back was genuine. They pay me in purpose, Marcus. That's a currency that doesn't depreciate. Take care of yourself. And next time you're in a simulator, remember today. Remember that the aircraft wants to fly. You just have to let it. Hawkeye 2-3 departing your frequency. Blue skis. The radio went silent. Marcus sat in his crippled Gulfstream, surrounded by emergency personnel, and watched the A-10 climb toward the southeast, growing smaller against the vast blue, until it vanished into the same sky it had emerged from. A medic was tapping on his window, shouting something about opening the door. Marcus took one last look at the sky where the A-10 had disappeared, then reached for the door release. The medics rushed in, moving immediately to his collapsed pilot, working with practiced efficiency. Someone was asking Marcus questions he barely heard. Someone else was examining his aircraft, documenting hydraulic fluid pooled on the tarmac, cataloging failures that should have killed him. An Air Force officer approached, introduced himself as Captain Morrison, and explained that Marcus would need to stay at Al-Assad until the investigation was complete and diplomatic clearances were arranged. Marcus barely processed the words. His mind was still in the sky, following an A-10 piloted by a woman whose last name he knew but whose face he'd never seen. Morrison must have noticed his distraction. You got lucky, the officer said. Hawkeye 2-3 is one of the best pilots in the squadron. If anyone could talk you down, it's her. Marcus focused on Morrison. Tell me about her. The officer seemed surprised by the question but considered it. Captain Vasquez, been flying A-10s for 12 years. 3 tour in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Syria. More combat hours than most fighter pilots accumulate in their entire careers. Her call sign, Hawkeye, came from her ability to spot threats before anyone else. She sees things others miss. Saved a lot of lives that way. She saved mine, Morrison nodded. She did, but that's not unusual for her. Last year, she provided cover for a downed helicopter crew for 6 hours, holding off insurgent forces until rescue arrived. Year before that, she flew through a sandstorm to support troops in contact when every other aircraft was grounded. She's got a reputation for showing up when things are worst. Marcus absorbed this information. Why A-10s? She's clearly talented enough to fly anything. Morrison glanced toward the sky where Vasquez had disappeared. I asked her that once. She said the A-10 matches her philosophy. It's built to take damage and protect others. It's not about being the fastest or the prettiest. It's about being where you're needed and refusing to quit. She said some pilots chase glory. She chases purpose. The words settled into Marcus like stones finding the bottom of a pond. He'd spent his career chasing metrics, market share, valuations. Purpose had been something he outsourced to mission statements written by consultants. But Vasquez had made purpose into something tangible, something that showed up in the sky when you needed it most. Over the next 3 days, while Marcus waited at Al-Assad for diplomatic clearances and aircraft recovery arrangements, he found himself thinking about those minutes in the air. He'd recorded the radio communications automatically. His Gulfstream's black box had captured everything. Late at night, in the sparse quarters assigned to him, Marcus played the recordings back, listening to Vasquez's voice guide him through the impossible. Each replay revealed new details. The way she'd anticipated his mistakes before he made them. The pauses where she'd let him figure things out rather than dictating every action. The moments where she'd offered reassurance calibrated precisely to his need. It was, Marcus realized, a masterclass in leadership that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with competence married to empathy. He requested Vasquez's contact information through official channels and was politely denied. Privacy regulations, operational security, standard protocol. But Morrison, taking pity on him, mentioned that Vasquez's squadron was based out of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. Marcus filed that information carefully. When his own jet was declared unrecoverable, the hydraulic damage too extensive for field repair, Marcus arranged commercial flights home. Before leaving Al-Assad, he stood on the runway where he'd landed, looking at the scorch marks his overheated brakes had left on the concrete, evidence that he'd survived. That someone he'd never met had cared enough to ensure his survival. Back in California, Marcus found his executive team had managed the crisis of his disappearance with impressive efficiency. His collapsed pilot was recovering in a Dubai hospital. Insurance adjusters were assessing aircraft value. Lawyers were preparing statements. The machinery of his empire had continued without him, which should have been reassuring but instead felt hollow. Marcus called a meeting with his senior leadership, 12 people who'd built their careers helping him build his fortune. He looked at them across the conference table and asked a question he'd never asked before. What's our purpose? Not our mission statement, not our value proposition. Why do we exist? What would be missing from the world if we disappeared tomorrow? The question created uncomfortable silence. His CFO, Alina, ventured an answer. We create shareholder value. We innovate. Marcus cut her off. That's what we do. I asked why we exist. What problem are we solving that actually matters? More silence. His CTO, James, tried next. We employ thousands of people. We contribute to the economy. So do casinos and tobacco companies, Marcus replied. I'm asking about purpose, about showing up when we're needed, about being the thing people are grateful exists. His executives exchanged glances that suggested concern for his mental state. Marcus didn't care. Something had changed in that cockpit, something that made the metrics and valuations seem like elaborate games played to avoid confronting whether any of it mattered. Over the following weeks, Marcus restructured his priorities with the same intensity he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. He established scholarship funds for children of military families. He created partnerships with organizations supporting veteran transitions to civilian life. He directed his company's considerable resources towards solving problems that wouldn't generate immediate returns but might make the world marginally less broken. His board questioned these decisions. Shareholders demanded explanations. Marcus told them about the A-10 pilot who'd saved his life and asked them to consider what it meant to be the kind of entity that showed up when needed rather than just when profitable. The initiatives moved forward. 6 months after his emergency landing, Marcus received an envelope with a Davis-Monthan Air Force Base return address. Inside was a single photograph, an A-10 Thunderbolt II, tail number visible, sitting on a tarmac with desert mountains in the background. On the back, handwritten in precise script, "The aircraft wants to fly. You just have to let it. RV." Marcus had the photograph framed and hung in his office, replacing the magazine covers and award plaques that had previously dominated the space. Visitors asked about it. Marcus told them it was a reminder that sometimes the ugliest, oldest, most underestimated things turned out to be exactly what you needed. Most visitors nodded politely and changed the subject, but occasionally someone understood. A year passed. Marcus's company evolved, its culture shifting in ways that made quarterly earnings calls more complicated but made looking in the mirror easier. He learned that purpose was expensive, that markets punished long-term thinking, that changing direction required constant justification. But he also learned that some metrics couldn't be captured in spreadsheets. The number of veterans his programs helped transition to meaningful work, the families whose burdens were lightened by scholarships, the problems solved that would never generate press releases. Then, at a technology conference in Phoenix, Marcus made a decision. He'd been invited to give a keynote about his company's new direction. Instead of flying commercial, he rented a car and drove the 90 minutes to Tucson. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base sat on Tucson's southeast side, home to the 355th Wing and multiple A-10 squadrons. Marcus had called ahead, explaining who he was and why he wanted to visit. The public affairs office was polite but non-committal. Visits required advance notice, security clearances, official purposes. Marcus persisted. He mentioned Captain Reina Vasquez, explained the emergency landing, offered to provide documentation. The tone shifted. 3 days later, he received approval for an escorted base tour. The public affairs officer who met Marcus at the gate was a young lieutenant named Sarah Chen, efficient and professional. She drove him past rows of aircraft, explaining the base's history, its role in A-10 operations, the planned modernization programs. Marcus listened politely, but his attention was elsewhere, scanning flight lines for tail numbers, looking for the aircraft from the photograph. "Is Captain Vasquez here?" Marcus finally asked. "I'd really like to meet her." Lieutenant Chen's expression became carefully neutral. "Captain Vasquez is currently deployed. She's been overseas for the past 4 months. I'm not authorized to disclose her location or expected return date." Marcus felt disappointed but not surprised. "Could you pass along a message? Tell her Marcus Rothwell stopped by. Tell her the Gulfstream pilot wanted to say thank you properly." "I can do that, sir." They continued the tour. Chen showed him maintenance facilities where A-10s were being upgraded with new wings, new avionics, new capabilities grafted onto airframes that had been flying since before most of their pilots were born. Marcus watched technicians working with precision that suggested they understood these aircraft weren't just machines but tools that saved lives. In a hangar, Marcus saw an A-10 being reassembled after major maintenance. The aircraft was stripped down to its essential form, and Marcus could appreciate the brutal elegance of its design. Everything about it suggested purpose over aesthetics. The massive GAU-8 cannon built into its nose, the engines mounted high to protect them from ground fire, the titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit to keep pilots alive. This was what Vasquez flew. This was what had appeared below his failing Gulfstream, like an answer to prayers he hadn't known how to articulate. "Can I sit in one?" Marcus asked. Chen looked uncertain. "That's unusual. These are operational aircraft." "I understand, but I'd really like to see what Captain Vasquez sees when she's up there." Something in his tone must have convinced her. Chen made a phone call, spoke quietly with someone, then nodded. We can arrange 5 minutes in a static display aircraft, but you can't touch any controls or switches. They walked to another hangar where an older A-10 sat. This one retired from flight status but maintained for educational purposes. A crew chief brought a ladder. Marcus climbed into the cockpit, settling into the seat Vasquez had occupied when she'd saved his life. The canopy was open, sunlight streaming in, but Marcus could imagine the enclosed focus of being alone in this space, responsible for the weapons and capabilities it represented. The cockpit was more cramped than his Gulfstream, more utilitarian. Every switch and display served a specific purpose. Nothing was wasted on comfort or convenience. Marcus put his hands on the stick and throttles, not moving them, just feeling their weight. From this seat, Vasquez had seen his crippled aircraft. From here, she'd made the decision to climb, to intercept, to guide a stranger through the worst moments of his life. From this position, she demonstrated what competence looked like when it was paired with commitment to something beyond self-interest. Marcus sat there until Chen politely indicated his time was up. Climbing down, Marcus felt like he was leaving sacred ground. The crew chief who'd brought the ladder studied Marcus with an expression that suggested he'd seen plenty of civilians take cockpit photos, but this was different. "You the Gulfstream guy?" the crew chief asked. Marcus nodded. "Captain Vasquez talked you down over a rock." "She did." The crew chief, whose name tape read TORRES, considered this. "She's the best pilot I've ever worked with, and I've been turning wrenches on these aircraft for 19 years. You know why? Why? Because she understands what these machines are for. Some pilots, they focus on the flying. The GS, the speed, the tactics, all important. But Hawkeye, she focuses on the people. The guys on the ground who need cover. The civilians caught in crossfire. The pilot in a crippled Gulfstream who needs someone to believe in them. She makes this aircraft into what it's supposed to be, a tool for saving lives." Torres glanced at the A-10 they'd been standing beside. "This one's her bird, actually. Tail number 810964. She's been flying it for 4 years, deployed with it on every rotation. We keep it maintained to standards that make the factory jealous because we know what she does with it, and we want her coming home every time." Marcus looked at the aircraft with new appreciation. Tail number 810964, the same number from the photograph. This was the exact aircraft that had appeared below his wing. Torres continued. "She asked me to do something unusual before her current deployment. Asked me to keep detailed maintenance logs accessible, to document every repair, every upgrade, every hour flown. I asked her why. She said somebody might come looking someday, somebody who'd want to understand the full story. I think she meant you." Marcus felt his throat tight. "Can I see the logs?" Torres looked at Lieutenant Chen, who after a moment's hesitation nodded. They walked to a small office adjacent to the hangar. Torres pulled up digital records on a computer that had seen better decades. The maintenance history of tail number 810964 scrolled across the screen, thousands of hours, multiple deployments, repairs ranging from routine to emergency. But Torres also pulled out a physical logbook, the kind that predated digital systems, that pilots and crew chiefs maintained out of tradition. He opened it to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. The entry was dated 6 months ago, shortly after Marcus's emergency landing. In precise handwriting, "Today this aircraft did what it was built to do. We saved someone who needed saving. The pilot I talked down over a rock asked why we fly old, ugly machines. I told him because old and ugly doesn't mean obsolete. It means proven. It means we've survived everything thrown at us and kept flying. That's worth remembering when people question whether we're still relevant. We're relevant every time someone needs us and we show up. Today we showed up. Capt. R. Vasquez, Hawkeye 23." Marcus read the entry 3 times. Torres watched him with an expression that suggested he understood the weight of what he was reading. "She writes something after every major mission," Torres explained. "Not the official after-action reports. Those go through channels. These are personal reflections. Some pilots don't think much beyond the tactical. Hawkeye thinks about the why." "Can I photograph this page?" Marcus asked. Chen intervened. Normally I'd say no, but this isn't classified material. Just don't post it on social media without obscuring identifying information. Marcus carefully photographed the logbook entry, making sure every word was captured. This was primary source material, evidence of philosophy in action, proof that the person who'd saved his life had thought deeply about what that action meant. Before leaving Davis-Monthan, Marcus walked the flight line one more time, looking at rows of A-10s in various states of readiness. Some were being armed for training missions. Others were undergoing maintenance. All of them radiated the same brutal purposefulness. Lieutenant Chen spoke quietly. "You should know, sir, there's been talk about retiring the A-10 fleet again. Budget pressures, modernization priorities, the usual arguments. Some people think these aircraft are outdated, that newer platforms can do the job better." Marcus turned to look at her. "What do you think?" Chen chose her words carefully. "I think there's a difference between what looks good in presentations and what works when everything's gone wrong. The A-10 isn't pretty. It's not fast. It doesn't win air-to-air battles. But when troops are in trouble, when someone needs close air support, when the mission is about saving lives rather than taking them, there's nothing better. Captain Vasquez proves that every time she flies." Marcus nodded slowly. "Is there any way I can help with the retirement debate?" Chen smiled. "That's above my pay grade, sir. But if you wanted to share your story with people who make budget decisions, I suspect it would be heard." The drive back to Phoenix gave Marcus time to think. By the time he reached his hotel, he'd made several decisions. First, he would testify before any congressional committee considering the A-10's retirement. His story, the civilian billionaire saved by military aviation's most underestimated platform, would carry weight in political circles that dismissed military advocacy as predictable. Second, he would establish a foundation specifically supporting A-10 squadrons and their personnel. Not just generic military charity, but targeted support for the people who flew and maintained the aircraft that had saved his life. Third, and most importantly, he would continue the transformation of his company with renewed purpose. Vasquez had asked him what kind of entity he wanted to be. He wanted to be the kind that showed up when needed. That made purpose more important than profit. That measured success in lives improved rather than markets dominated. Back in California, Marcus assembled his team again. "I need you to clear my calendar for the next month. I'm going to Washington." His chief of staff, Michael, raised eyebrows. "For what purpose?" "To save an aircraft that saved my life." The story Marcus told congressional staffers, budget analysts, and defense committee members was simple and true. A billionaire tech mogul, alone in a failing aircraft over hostile airspace, had been guided to safety by a pilot flying a 40-year-old ground attack platform that budget proposals wanted to retire. The juxtaposition was powerful. Modern wealth saved by old warfare. Cutting-edge technology failing where proven design succeeded. Marcus didn't argue tactics or strategy. He left that to military professionals. Instead, he talked about what it felt like to see that A-10 appear, to hear Vasquez's steady voice, to follow her down through altitude that felt like falling until it became landing. He talked about competence and purpose, and the difference between platforms designed to impress and platforms designed to endure. The testimony received media coverage. Marcus's profile gave the story reach it wouldn't have had from military sources alone. Reporters who typically covered technology and business suddenly wrote about close air support and airframe service life. The narrative spread. Billionaire becomes unlikely advocate for military's least glamorous aircraft. Editorials appeared in defense publications. Television news segments featured retired A-10 pilots explaining the platform's unique capabilities. Budget analysts were forced to address public interest their models hadn't predicted. The A-10 retirement proposal stalled in committee, delayed for further review. Marcus knew this was temporary victory, that budget battles were never truly won, only postponed. But postponement meant more time, more missions, more pilots like Vasquez proving the aircraft's continued relevance. 3 months after his testimony, Marcus received another envelope from Davis-Monthan. Inside was a squadron patched the 354th Fighter Squadron, the outfit Vasquez flew with. The patch showed a bulldog wearing a pilot's helmet, fierce and determined. Accompanying the patch was a brief note on official letterhead. "Mr. Rothwell, your advocacy made a difference. Our funding was restored. Our aircraft will continue flying. More importantly, you reminded people why we do this. Not for the machines, but for the moments when someone needs us and we can be there. Thank you for telling our story. Your honorary bulldog now. LT, call Marcus Chen, 354th Fighter Squadron Commander." Marcus had the patch mounted in a shadow box next to the A-10 photograph, creating a small shrine to the day his life changed. Visitors still asked about it. Marcus's answer evolved. He no longer just mentioned the emergency landing. He talked about meeting competence in its purest form, about discovering that value and cost weren't the same thing, about learning that purpose was something you built through choices that made quarterly reports harder but made the mirror easier. 2 years after the emergency landing, Marcus sold his company. Not because it was failing, the opposite. The transformation he'd initiated had created a valuable organization with clear values and committed employees. But Marcus realized he was ready for something different. He'd proven that business could serve purpose. Now he wanted to serve purpose directly. He established the Hawkeye Foundation, dedicated to supporting military families and veterans transitioning to civilian life. The name honored Vasquez, though she'd never sought recognition. The foundation's work focused on practical support, job placement, education funding, mental health resources, family assistance. The things that mattered to people who'd served and now needed help navigating different battles. Marcus ran the foundation with the same intensity he'd brought to building companies, but with different metrics. Success wasn't measured in valuations but in lives stabilized, families supported, transitions made smoother. It was harder work, less obviously profitable but more deeply satisfying. 3 years after the emergency landing, Marcus was in Tucson for a foundation event when he received a call from Lieutenant Chen, now Captain Chen, still handling public affairs at Davis-Monthan. "Mr. Rothwell, I thought you should know Captain Vasquez is rotating back stateside next week. Her deployment is ending. She'll be at Davis-Monthan for at least the next 2 years. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. Would she be willing to meet? I asked her when the orders came through. She said yes, said it was probably time. They arranged the meeting at a coffee shop off base, neutral ground where rank and formality could be temporarily suspended. Marcus arrived early, nervous in a way he hadn't felt since pitching his first investors decades ago. Captain Reina Vasquez walked in exactly on time, wearing civilian clothes that made her look smaller than Marcus had imagined. She was compact, athletic, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that registered details the way a pilot's eyes should. She spotted Marcus immediately, crossed to his table, and extended her hand. "Mr. Rothwell, good to finally meet face to face." Her grip was firm, her smile genuine. Marcus stood, shook her hand, found himself momentarily speechless. This was the voice that had guided him through the impossible. This was the person who'd made saving strangers into a profession. They sat. Vasquez ordered black coffee. Marcus asked the question that had been building for 3 years. "Why did you do it? You could have reported my position and let someone else handle the intercept. Why risk your aircraft, your career, your life for someone you'd never met?" Vasquez considered the question with the same deliberation she probably brought to tactical decisions. "Because that's the job, not the official job description, but the actual job. We don't fly A-10s because they're glamorous. We fly them because when everything goes wrong for someone, we can be the thing that goes right. You needed help. I had the training, the position, the capability to provide that help. Everything else was just details." Marcus absorbed this. "You made it look easy." Vasquez laughed. "It wasn't easy. You were panicking, overcorrecting, fighting the aircraft. I was watching your control surfaces from below, seeing every mistake before you made it, trying to figure out how to keep you from killing yourself through well-intentioned incompetence. But you also listened. You trusted me. You did the work. A lot of pilots with 40 hours wouldn't have had the humility to follow instructions from someone they couldn't even see clearly. I didn't have much choice. Everyone has choices. You could have frozen, could have given up, could have decided this was impossible and just waited to crash. You didn't. That's why you survived. I provided guidance. You did the flying. They talked for 2 hours. Marcus learned that Vasquez had grown up in Albuquerque, daughter of a civil engineer and a high school teacher. She'd wanted to fly since childhood but had been told repeatedly that women didn't belong in fighter cockpits, especially not in close air support aircraft that operated in the worst conditions. She'd ignored the advice and pursued the path anyway, accumulating rejections and resistance until someone finally gave her a chance. Once in the cockpit, she'd proven herself through performance that left no room for argument. The A-10 community is different, Vasquez explained. We're not as worried about prestige. We care about results. Can you put ordnance on target? Can you keep troops alive? Can you survive ground fire and bring your aircraft home? If you can do those things, nobody cares about your demographics. Marcus told her about his testimony, the foundation, the ways his life had changed because of those minutes in the air. Vasquez listened with the same focused attention she'd probably given to radio communications, absorbing information, processing implications. You didn't have to do any of that, she said when Marcus finished. Most people I've helped, I never hear from them again. They get saved, they go back to their lives, they file the experience under close call and move on. You built something that matters. I wanted to pay forward what you gave me. You already did, by landing that aircraft. By not giving up. Every time you trusted my instructions instead of your panic, you paid forward. The rest is just amplification. They exchanged contact information. Vasquez promised to visit the Foundation's headquarters, to speak with veterans the organization was helping, to share her transition experiences. Marcus promised to stop pestering Air Force Public Affairs for updates on her deployment status. As they prepared to leave, Marcus asked one final question. Do you ever regret choosing this career? The deployment's the danger, the time away from normal life, Vasquez smiled. Normal life is overrated. I chose a path that lets me be the answer to someone's worst day. You can't buy that kind of purpose. And every time I land after a mission, every time I shut down engines and climb out of the cockpit knowing I helped someone, I'm reminded why I do this. The money's terrible, the hours are worse, but the meaning is infinite. I wouldn't trade it. They parted in the parking lot. Marcus watched Vasquez drive away in a practical sedan that probably cost less than he spent on business lunches. She looked like anyone else, completely unremarkable, which was perhaps the point. Heroism didn't require spectacle. Competence didn't need announcement. Purpose was something you lived quietly until the moment it needed to be loud. Over the following years, Marcus and Vasquez maintained irregular contact. She'd send photos from deployments, usually landscapes rather than aircraft, capturing moments of beauty in places known mostly for conflict. He'd update her on Foundation work, on veterans helped, on families supported. They met occasionally when her schedule allowed, always off base, always casual. The friendship was understated but genuine, built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Through Vasquez, Marcus met other A-10 pilots, each with their own stories of missions flown and lives saved. He learned about close air support in Afghanistan, where pilots spent hours circling overhead, conserving fuel and ammunition until ground controllers called for help. He heard about Syria, where A-10s had protected advancing forces from entrenched positions. He understood Iraq, where the aircraft had flown thousands of sorties, becoming a symbol of American air power that focused on precision over spectacle. Each pilot Marcus met echoed Vasquez's philosophy. They'd chosen the A-10 not despite its limitations, but because of them. The aircraft demanded skill. It required patience. It rewarded pilots who understood that effective combat wasn't about dominating the sky, but about supporting people on the ground who needed help surviving. 5 years after his emergency landing, Marcus was invited to speak at an Air Force symposium about civilian-military partnerships. Vasquez was there, now a major, wearing her dress uniform with the kind of quiet pride that came from earning every decoration through repeated proof of competence. After Marcus's presentation, Vasquez took the stage to discuss close air support evolution. Her remarks were technical, detailed, focused on tactics and capabilities, but she closed with a story. 5 years ago, I intercepted a civilian aircraft in distress over Iraq. The pilot was untrained. The aircraft was failing. The situation was deteriorating. I could have reported the contact and let someone else handle it, but I made a choice to get involved, to guide this person through the worst experience of his life. That choice didn't just save one person. It created a relationship that's helped hundreds of veterans transition to meaningful civilian work. It sparked advocacy that preserved funding for aircraft and squadrons that continue saving lives. One decision, made in seconds, compounded into consequences I couldn't have predicted. She paused, scanning the audience. That's the nature of our work. We make choices in moments of crisis. Those choices ripple outward in ways we'll never fully see. Which means we have to choose wisely, choose compassionately, choose with the understanding that we're not just solving immediate problems but potentially reshaping futures. The civilian I helped that day chose to reshape his future around purpose. He could have just been grateful and moved on. Instead, he asked what his survival meant and built an answer worth living. That's the highest form of service, taking what you've been given and using it to give to others. The audience applauded. Marcus felt his eyes stinging with tears he hadn't anticipated. Vasquez had taken their shared experience and distilled it into philosophy, into instruction, into meaning that transcended the specific event and became principle. After the symposium, they walked the flight line together, watching A-10's launch for evening training missions. The sun was setting, painting the aircraft in gold and shadow. Vasquez stopped beside tail number 810964, the same aircraft that had appeared below Marcus's Gulfstream 5 years earlier. "She's getting old," Vasquez said, running her hand along the fuselage. "We've replaced the wings, upgraded the avionics, modernized the weapon systems, but the core airframe is original, 1979 construction, older than most of the pilots who fly her now." "Does she fly differently?" Marcus asked. "Every aircraft flies a little differently. This one's familiar. I know her quirks, her tendencies, the sounds she makes when something's wrong. We've been through a lot together, 3 deployments, countless training missions, one very important rescue. She's carried me safely through everything. I trust her." Marcus understood they weren't just talking about machinery. "When will you retire her?" Vasquez smiled. "The aircraft or me?" "Either. Both. The aircraft will fly until the Air Force decides she can't anymore. Could be 5 years, could be 15. Depends on budgets and priorities, and whether people remember why we need platforms that can loiter, that can survive ground fire, that can operate from rough fields and damaged runways. As for me, I've got maybe 5 more years before age and regulations push me toward other work. But those 5 years will be full. There's always someone who needs help, always a mission worth flying." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last training flight launch into the deepening twilight. The A-10s climbed slowly, gaining altitude with deliberate purpose rather than dramatic acceleration. Even their departure was workmanlike, focused on mission rather than spectacle. Marcus thought about the 5 years since his emergency landing. The companies sold, the foundations built, the lives redirected toward purpose instead of profit. All of it traced back to this aircraft, this pilot, this moment when competence and compassion had intersected to create survival. "Thank you," Marcus said, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "For everything, for saving my life, for changing how I see the world, for showing me what service looks like when it's genuine." Vasquez turned to face him. "You don't need to keep thanking me. You've built something meaningful from that day. You've taken your second chance and used it to create more second chances for others. That's the only thanks I need, seeing that the life I helped save was worth saving." The last A-10 climbed into the darkening sky, its silhouette becoming indistinct against the stars that were beginning to emerge. Marcus watched until it disappeared, then looked at the woman who taught him that purpose was something you flew toward deliberately, with patience and skill, until you arrived exactly where you needed to be. Somewhere overhead, pilots were training for missions they'd fly tomorrow or next month or next year. preparing to be the answer to someone's worst day, learning to guide strangers through impossible situations with voices that carried calm despite chaos, becoming the kind of competence that looked like magic to people who'd never seen it before. And on the ground, a foundation built from gratitude continued, helping veterans find their way back to purpose, one transition at a time, proving that service didn't end with uniforms but could extend into whatever came next if you chose to make it matter. Marcus drove back to his hotel that evening thinking about legacy. Not the legacy of wealth or achievement, but the legacy of choices made when everything was on the line. The choice to climb toward a failing aircraft instead of reporting and departing. The choice to guide instead of command. The choice to believe in someone's capability even when they doubted it themselves. Those choices couldn't be captured in quarterly reports or market valuations. They lived in the space between people, in the moments when competence met crisis, and decided that helping was worth the cost. Marcus had built his career on disruption, on breaking systems and rebuilding them more efficiently. But Vasquez had shown him something different, that some systems didn't need disruption but devotion, that old and proven sometimes beat new and untested, that ugly and effective outperformed pretty and fragile. The A-10 Thunderbolt II would eventually be retired. Budget pressures would win, modernization would demand it, newer platforms would promise better capability. But until that day, pilots like Vasquez would continue flying them, continue proving their worth through missions that didn't make headlines but made differences that mattered completely to the people being helped. And people like Marcus would continue telling the story, reminding decision makers that value wasn't just measured in specifications and performance metrics, but in lives saved, in second chances given, in purpose demonstrated through action rather than promise through presentation. The sky above Tucson darkened fully, stars emerging in patterns that had guided humans for millennia. Somewhere up there, A-10 pilots were practicing approaches, refining skills, preparing for the moment when someone would need them and they'd need to be perfect. Below, in hotels and homes and hangars, the infrastructure of service continued maintenance crews checking systems, planners plotting missions, families supporting the people who'd chosen this life. Marcus fell asleep that night thinking about the sound of Vasquez's voice in his headphones, steady as a heartbeat, guiding him through altitude that felt like drowning until it became floating, then landing, then living. That voice had saved his life. But more importantly, it had taught him what a life could be if you built it around showing up for people who needed you, around turning competence into compassion, around making purpose into something you flew toward deliberately, even when the aircraft was old, the mission was unglamorous, and the only reward was knowing you'd been the answer to someone's worst day. In the morning, Marcus would return to foundation work, to helping veterans find their footing in civilian life, to building systems that served rather than extracted. But tonight, he was simply grateful for the pilot who'd appeared when needed, for the aircraft that had carried them both safely, for the lesson that purpose wasn't something you discovered but something you chose repeatedly until it became who you were. Somewhere in Tucson, Vasquez was probably sleeping too, resting before tomorrow's training missions. Or maybe she was awake, planning, preparing, doing the invisible work that made visible competence possible. Either way, she'd be ready when called. That was the promise she'd made to herself and to everyone who might someday need an A-10 to appear low, guiding them out of the fire and toward safety they couldn't quite believe in until they touched ground and understood they'd survive.